Our gospel reading this morning comes from the 14th chapter of Matthew, verses 13 through 21, which you can find on page 3 of your bulletin. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Would you pray with me? Gracious and holy God, we ask you to make your presence known among us now, so that our eyes might be opened and that we might see the one who stands before us with his arms outstretched, asking for what we have to place in those hands. We ask that you would bless us so that we may become a blessing for others, that the word that you have prepared for us today might transform us, and that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts might be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I have to admit that I'm still a little bit buzzing over what happened just a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who were here on Easter Sunday, you might remember that we had 193 people in this sanctuary, almost 200 people in this small country church building. It was I just love the way that sounds, 200 people in here. We had so many people, in fact, we had to set up folding chairs at the back of the sanctuary. We had so many people here that Sunday, get this, the front pew was full. I know. At Simpsonville, you have to get here early if you want a seat in the back. That's just the way that we roll. You know, and then the next week we had 115, which is remarkable because typically that's called low attendance Sunday, the Sunday after Easter, but not here at Simpsonville Christian Church this year. That brings our average for 2014 up to 101. Our average for 2013 was 97, and the running average from the beginning of 13 to date is 98, but I'm not keeping track or anything, just so you know. It's not hard to guess why it is that we are growing. Some of that is circumstantial. We just live in a community that is growing, and that is exciting. There's a lot of great, understandable reasons why Simpsonville is growing. There are wonderful schools, wonderful, safe communities, great people. It's an inexpensive cost of living compared with some other areas that are closer to Louisville or Lexington or Frankfurt. It's an accessible place. It's a wonderful, wonderful place to live. There's no guess as to why it is people are coming out here. And the same is true for this church. You find a lot of warm, inviting people. And when people come in here and they experience worship with us, they tell me, you know, I've never felt so loved, so accepted, so received warmly by what feels like family. It feels like home here at Simpsonville Christian Church. I know some of you have experienced that. Now, while I may or may not be tracking the numbers, I will be the first to admit that worship attendance is not the only metric that we can use to see what's happening here, and it might not even be the most important thing that we pay attention to. I think more important, I think that we would be wiser to make sure that we are remaining a strong congregation rather than just becoming a bigger congregation for the sake of becoming bigger. I think it's more important to be a strong congregation. And one of the ways that we can measure how strong of a congregation we are is by seeing how engaged and involved the people are within these church walls, the degree to which they become engaged and involved in the life of others within the church and also with the community outside of these church walls. That is a couple of the ways that we can measure how strong of a congregation we are. And I think that we see that too. We see people who have been here for a long time, people who are new, who are getting more involved in the work of the church and the work of the community. And if you're one of those people, you might have noticed something interesting, which is that when you become more engaged in the needs of the world, you realize that the needs of the world are a whole lot bigger than you first imagined. It might have been that we envisioned our community as only being this big, but as we get more engaged and more involved and explore these connections and relationships we have, we find out our neighborhood is really more like this. And it isn't just a couple people who walk through the doors looking for a little bit of help, who are needing some assistance or some guidance. It's actually a large number of people who are out there needing help and assistance and guidance. And you find that it's a deeper situation than we first might imagine, that it isn't just that somebody needs a bag of groceries to get through the week, that oftentimes there are chronic and systemic issues of poverty and unemployment or underemployment. Very complicated issues because we're dealing with people, and people are complicated. Of course, you don't have to be in church to recognize that this is kind of the way that things are. If you are alive in the early part of the 21st century and you have access to information from across the globe that comes in through our televisions or newspapers, the internet, you can see that there are great big problems in the world, and it's very difficult to see precisely how it is that we are going to tackle and solve these problems. We know that right now, and you don't have to be a Christian to observe this, but we know that right now there are 29 million human slaves in the world today, which is more than at any time else in human history. In the United States of America, perhaps the wealthiest nation ever to exist in civilization, we have 45% of all children who live in households of low income, who can't provide on their own some basic necessities. That's 45% of all kids. That's 32 million children. 16 million children, or 22% of all kids, live in homes below the poverty line, which is $24,850 per year for a family of 4. These are great big issues, and I don't think that in the modern age that our problem is one of apathy. I don't think that we're in a situation where these problems persist because we just don't care. I don't believe that, because I think we do care. I know that we care. I see people that care. I think what we suffer from primarily is the sense of overwhelmedness. I mean, these problems are enormous, and I don't care if you're a church that worships 10 people or 10,000 people. When we're dealing with some of the issues, some of the shadows that hang over our society today, we will always feel like what we have is inadequate. Now, I have to wonder if that's the way the disciples felt in this passage that we heard this morning from Matthew 14. I have to wonder if this is the way the disciples... Now, the disciples are this core group of people who have made the commitment to follow Jesus. They have heard His voice calling them, and they have responded with, "I will follow you wherever you go." And so they are following this man. And as they follow Him, they see Him go from place to place to place. And in this particular scene, Jesus has just heard about the death of John the Baptist. That's what comes right before what we've heard. And as Jesus tends to do whenever the wicked kingdoms of this world bump up against the kingdom of heaven, Jesus withdraws. And so the disciples see Jesus withdraw to what is said a deserted place. Now, the Greek word that is translated as a deserted place is translated elsewhere in the New Testament as the desert or the wilderness. Now, if we are a people who believe that this book we call the Bible tells us a little bit about who we are, if we identify who we are within the narrative of the Bible as a whole, then it is very important for us to understand this important metaphor of the wilderness. What is the wilderness all about? The wilderness is a dangerous place. The wilderness is a lonely place. The wilderness is the place that the people of Israel wandered behind their leader Moses for an entire generation after being released from captivity out of Egypt. The wilderness is a place where only God can save you. Only God can provide for you. The wilderness is what stands in between the long-lost people of God who are held in captivity in Babylon and their home in Zion. It's that wilderness that is in between them. The wilderness is where the Spirit drove the Son of God to be tempted by the devil. The wilderness is a scary, dangerous place, and it is the wilderness that Jesus withdraws to in this scene. But the thing is, the crowds hear about this. The crowds, not the disciples. These are the crowds. This is the larger community. These are the people out there that haven't made this commitment. They haven't heard the call yet, but they hear rumors about this man Jesus and the amazing things that he's done. And so they leave their towns and their villages and they follow him into the wilderness. And so the disciples watch Jesus get off the boat, and he walks into this scene and he sees all of these vast crowds of people, and he has compassion on them. And he begins to cure their illnesses. He begins to heal their sick. Now the disciples are watching this and they start to notice that it's getting late. The sun is going down and it's getting dark, and after all, they're in the wilderness. So they come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, it's getting late. You might want to send these people away because they're probably getting hungry. You should send them back into their towns so that they can get for themselves something to eat. These are hungry people, and we know from the story that says 5,000 men besides women and children. So really, this could be 10, 15,000 people, and they're getting hungry. Jesus, if you care for these people, send them back so they can get something to eat. This is a dangerous, scary situation we're in. And Jesus turns to them and says, they don't need to go away to be fed. You feed them. That's why you're my disciples. That's what you've been called to do. And they say, well, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. I mean, we barely have enough to feed ourselves. We can't feed 15,000 people with what we have. Now, this is the thing. We're in a sermon series right now called Give Me a Sign, looking at 4 miracles of Jesus. And this is one of the interesting things about some of the miracles. It's hard to determine when the miracle exactly happens. It's hard to pinpoint the precise moment that something miraculous happens in these stories. It's the same with the one we heard last week, the miracle during the wedding at Cana. We don't know precisely when the water became wine. We only knew after the fact that it had happened. And I think the same thing happens here. The boundary lines around this miracle are kind of fuzzy, but I would suggest to you that something begins to happen, that the miracle starts to happen when Jesus reveals to his disciples that they have something more than they thought, that they have something more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. They don't just have 5 loaves and 2 fish. They have 5 loaves, 2 fish, and something else. They have 5 loaves, 2 fish, and someone else. They have 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the Son of God who stands before them with his hands open saying, bring them to me. And they take the 5 loaves and 2 fish and they put them in his hands, and he takes the bread and he lifts it up to heaven, and he blesses it, and he breaks it, and he gives it back to them. And then the disciples take what has been touched with the hand of compassion and mercy out into the crowds. And it says not only that everyone got something to eat, but that all were filled. That there was so much left over, they were able to collect basketfuls of it. 12 basketfuls of pieces left over after this miracle. They have more than they ever imagined. Now, I think the same is true for us, that we must come to realize that we have something more than we imagine. We sit here in this church and we know that there is a lot of bad news being proclaimed outside these walls. We know that there's a lot of bad news echoing around the globe. And what do we have in the face of so much bad news? 1 hour of worship? 1 hour of worship to come together, 1 sermon, 1 small attempt to proclaim just a little bit of good news in the face of this massive amount of bad news. Is that all we have? You know, there are stories being told out there, lies that are being repeated, that who you are and who I am are not the precious children of God, that what we are consumers or interchangeable cogs in the economic machine, that that's what we really are and that is the extent of our existence. Those are lies that are being told. And what do we have to combat that? 2 Sunday school classes? I mean, come on. You know, there is a lot of need in this community of hunger, of jobs. And what do we have? We have people that have needs, and we have a food pantry about the size of a closet. You know, all we have is an hour or 2 that we can dedicate to volunteering at this church. We just have a little bit of time to spend with our youth to help educate them and to help guide them and to help love them and care and nurture for them. Do you know what we're up against? Have you turned on the television lately? What you think that we have in this 1 hour a week for our different groups of kids enough to combat all of this that they are encountering on a day-to-day life? Is that really enough? Of course it isn't. We have our meager offerings, this little bit of financial resources that we have left over after we try to meet the mounting piles of debt and bills that just keeps getting larger and larger and larger in our society. Just these little meager offerings that we can bring and put them into the plate. And we're looking to see if these miracles that we hear about in this story have any relevance to us today. And I would say to you that something happens when we recognize that we do indeed have something more than we thought. We have something more than these meager resources. We have something more than these inadequate things that we bring before the great needs of the world. We have the one that stands before us with his hands open. We have the one who prepares the table that we come to every week. We have the one that stands at the great banquet and invites all to come. Anyone who would have ears to hear the invitation are invited to come. Not just the righteous and the holy, but the sinners and the unclean. Those who have been broken and marginalized. Those who have been excluded from fellowship in our larger community. All are called to come to this table. And this is the one which we get down on our knees humbly and bring our offerings to. And he takes them, that 1 hour of worship a week, those few hours a week that we have to give, that 1 weekend that we have a year to give in a mission trip, those little tiny small financial offerings we are able to bring, that small food pantry, we take those things and we place them in his hands. And he lifts them to heaven and he blesses them and he breaks them. And he gives them back to us to take and distribute into the world. And we recognize that we have something so much more. What we have is a miracle. In a moment you're going to hear Melissa Emery get up and talk about what happens when we take what little we have in the name of Christ and bring it to the world and what power that can do. And if you're wondering, well, how is it? You speak about taking things and putting them into Jesus' hands. How does that happen? Well, when we come together, we have more than we have individually. But not in the way where 1 + 1 = 2. It's not that just I have a little and you have a little and you have a little and we bring in and we have more. It's more than that. When we come together, we are able to bring the presence of someone else. When we come together in the context of worship, it's not that we have 5 cents here and 5 cents here, we add it up and we got $1. We have something so much more and so much more valuable. This is why we come to worship. This is why we come into community. This is why we listen, and despite the overwhelming nature of the world's problems, we never lose hope. What we have is a miracle. Amen.